Welcome to our Just Talk, Talk Just panel discussion Living Water, Race, Land, and the Environment. Sponsored by the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Our panelists are Veronica Carter, North Carolina Coastal Federation Board of Directors; Candace Laughinghouse, eco-womanist scholar and activist; and Garen Lorraine, Associate Director for the Center for Ecological Regeneration at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Our host and moderator is Dr. Rodney Sadler, Associate Professor of Bible and Director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Dr. Sadler, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, Mike. It's wonderful to be here with you all this evening. I'd like to welcome you all to this edition of our monthly broadcast, Just Talk, Talk Just. This is a program of Union Presbyterian Seminary that's grown out of a partnership between the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership and the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. These programs began back in 2020 during the global COVID pandemic as the George Floyd uprisings were taking the world by storm. We sought to make these programs ways of addressing the intersectional issues of race, gender, and class from a biblically and theologically sensitive perspective. We knew early on that these would not be just any other conversations, that these would be necessarily controversial as we entered into conversation about often contested issues, but issues that we needed to explore. Our name was born from the need to just talk in a world where we've retreated to our partisan corners. Rarely do we communicate with anyone about issues that matter unless they agree with us. What if we could simply just talk to one another? But we also know that these could not be conversations that get bogged down in the morass of the partisan political divide. We didn't want to privilege partisan political camps or ideological positions like left or right. No, we would privilege God's justice, centering this notion that arises from our Christian, biblical, and theological beliefs. We would not just talk, we would also talk just. The Just Talk, Talk Just conversations are intentionally provocative in title and content. We aim to open up discussions which will often be about difficult topics that are crucial to the church and our present moment. We believe that we cannot shy away from these conversations, nor can we keep silent during moments when our culture needs to hear a prophetic voice. We encourage you to attend, listen, ask questions, and consider what it is that God may be saying about these issues that we explore together. It is in this way that we can expand our horizons and inspire the church to work towards greater justice and equity. Let's open up with a word of prayer. Holy One, it's once again that we come before you with thanksgiving in our hearts. We're grateful for this conversation tonight as we wrestle with the way that we often not only abuse the people who are made in your image, but the planet that you made us from. You said that we are the B'nai Ha'adam, that we are taken min ha'adamah. We are taken from this earth, from this land. Help us to be responsible citizens. Help us to care for the land that you have made. Help us to realize that we can have healthy people without having a healthy planet. Use us as we engage in conversation tonight, that someone's heart might be open, someone's world might be changed, that someone might be inspired to do this, your good work in the world. We ask that we would always be found useful to you for Christ's sake. Amen. Well, we as Americans all say that we love our waters and our land and our nation. They're among the greatest gifts of America, part of what gives us the potential to be great. Well-watered, fertile lands support forests and farmlands that feed our collective spirits and bodies, helping us to thrive as a people. But not all of us get to thrive. Far too often we see that our waters and land are under attack by corporate greed and callous indifference. Worse, the waters and land that are most at risk are those in Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. We are grateful that you are joining us for a conversation with leaders in the environmental justice movements as we discuss the need to protect our most vulnerable communities as race influences patterns of pollution. This is an issue that really shows us the impact that race has on everyone, because our willingness to defile the land of those whose lives we view as least ultimately impacts us all. The environment that we endanger knows no racial boundaries. We will all suffer from the harm that we ignore in minoritized communities. Thus, we all need to work together to respond to this crisis in minoritized communities like it was in all of our own communities, because in reality, inevitably, it is. I'm so pleased to have this panel with us tonight. Really excited to have good friends and even returning students back on this panel. I'll start off introducing one of my guests. She's going to hate the way I say this, but Major Veronica Carter, retired Army. Major Carter is currently serving as a council member for the town of Leyland, North Carolina. She served on the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality's Secretary's inaugural Environmental Justice and Equity Board. She currently serves on the North Carolina Coastal Federation Board of Directors, the Duke Superfund Community Engagement Corps Advisory Board, and the North Carolina Gullah Geechee Greenway Blueway Heritage Trail Board of Directors. I don't know when you have time to sleep.
I don't.
I know the feeling.
Thank you, Rodney.
Garen Lorraine is the Associate Director of the Center for Ecological Regeneration at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. They received their Master of Divinity from Union Presbyterian Seminary and PhD in Ethics and Society from Vanderbilt University. Let me say to you, Garen, welcome home.
Thank you, Rodney.
Glad to have you with us. Dr. Candace Laughinghouse holds a PhD in Womanist and Environmental Justice Studies, or Eco-Womanism, from the Chicago Theological Seminary, and has served as a professor at Shaw Divinity School and St. Augustine College in Raleigh, North Carolina. She's a frequent speaker on issues of environmental and climate justice issues and their intersection with race and theology. Hence, I'm extraordinarily happy that you're here with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Great to have you. Great to have you all here tonight. So let me get started with a few questions as we begin our work tonight. I mentioned before that Just Talk, Talk Just began during the George Floyd uprisings. What are the intersections between environmental justice and racial justice movements? I'll start with you, Dr. Laughinghouse.
Okay, so yes, my work is greatly involved and situated within issues of the environment, race, also gender, and I also add another one, non-human animals, and this inter connection. But the intersection between environmental justice and racial justice largely has to deal with the laws that are passed.
Mhm.
For many of those who might not know, in this, and here in North Carolina, I'm in North Carolina, the environmental justice movement is known to have been started here, and it was largely due to laws being passed approving, cancerous materials, and of course, in communities of color. And this goes not just from there, but even with Dr. Robert Ballard's work. So these things are connected because oftentimes, these laws are passed to, more or less get rid of these things that are just going to come about when it comes to all these things that we're producing, these plastics, anything, even wood particles have been known to have been thrown into bodies of water, of course, where there are minoritized communities. And why is that? Because they do not expect many people of color to come out. They do not expect many people of color to even know anything about the laws, which oftentimes we don't, because we're working, 2, 3 jobs just to keep a partial roof sometimes over our heads. So it's a huge connection, because while we're talking about climate change and care for the earth, there's a direct connection with the continuous like heating up of this earth with what's going on in these communities of color primarily. And we say communities of color, but also we know those are areas also where there are poor whites. And so these things are largely connected because the environment for us to even talk about caring for the earth,
Mhm.
these large nonprofit companies talking about that, they have to be able to face the issues of race that are directly connected to why we have these things, being thrown back into earth.
Thank you so much. And I thank you so much for also tying this together. That when we talk about the impact on Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, poor white communities also fit within that same paradigm. We
Yeah.
often try to divide people apart racially, but we need to realize that we've got interests that are intertwined, and we need to learn how to work together to address these concerns. Dr. Lorraine, what do you say about the intersection between environmental justice and issues of race?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Laughinghouse that there is the legal aspect sort of that this is written into code at the very fabric, sort of the very start of this nation. You
Mhm.
get this written into code, and you get environmental policy from removal, from indigenous removal, sort of onward. And the communities that get that impact have that long history there. I also think that there's this that legally there's that feels very accessible, and that's where we can get at and do a lot of work in. And there's also the stuff that feels really big that matters, like wildfires that burn globally, not just in the United States, but globally impact poor communities of color on scales that are, I believe, 4 times as much as sort of richer, whiter communities. So there's the big sort of planetary concern that feels so overwhelming to get, but that starts at those global scales. That starts at sort of choosing to build coal factories or choosing to redo those things. And those are impacting the local communities, like local poor and Black and Brown communities and Indigenous communities. And then that then gets, doubled or tripled or quadrupled onto global scale. So you get a double hit. You get sort of this local law, and then you get it on the back end too, where your air qualities are low, your air quality is low, your water quality is low. In the case of Warren County in North Carolina, you get the leaching into the water. And then you get them choosing communities to sort of put infrastructure in to this day. I mean, this is still a thing. Virginia had just got in where unions at, you just have this battle sort of with them choosing to put compressor stations in Black and Brown communities that are both displacing, but then you're getting there's something called a kill zone, so you get sort of those risks too. You get the actual blow up risk, and so it's just I don't think you can have one without the other. And I'm not that I don't think you can't. I'm 10 toes deep would say you can't have environmental justice without also seeking racial justice.
And thank you for this. And actually, I would love for you to talk. You have Indigenous heritage as well. How does this disparately impact the Indigenous community?
Yeah, it's the same. I mean, you're getting the same policies that are impacting Indigenous people.
Mhm.
It's nuanced in a very different way because you have you have sovereignty at play when it's acknowledged. I think, and right now Navajo Nation is coming into my head because they're just now I think settling their water pact to get sort of water rights to Navajo Nation, which is the Navajo Res has some water issues, and I invite you all to explore those and do some deeper work into that. But that's dealing sort of with state and national governments. So to get clean water, to even get access to clean water. So you're also dealing with sort of this nation to nation relationship. But you also get the same thing. You get sort of dams built on, sacred lands that destroy historic food sources, that displace non-human beings. You get, and those are disproportionately chosen sort of in the same way. So there's particularity, but there's also just there's a very broad stroke that's being done here. And it's really people that can be othered.
Mhm.
are people that are othered, and their lives are sort of they're calculated.
Yeah. Interesting that we can often write off certain groups of people and the way that we treat them based upon the way that we view them through a racialized lens. Thank you for that. Major Carter, I know that as we talked about the environmental, the DEQ board, one of the things that we wrestled with there was disparate impact. Can you say a little bit about what disparate impact means?
Well, I was just sitting here in my mind trying to tie together the intersectional civil rights. There are some communities that you're going to have an impact on more than others, and that ties into the civil rights issue that we have here. You can't do environmental justice without thinking of racial justice, because what you're doing is taking something and putting it into communities of least resistance, and particularly in the South, those are communities of color, or they are communities of low economic impact, or they are communities that are indigenous or even undocumented, because they are the communities that will not go out to vote or don't go out to vote. Many times it's not because they don't want to, it's
Mhm.
because laws, as someone mentioned before, laws have prevented them from. The Voting Rights Act has been gutted. The Fair Housing Act has been gutted. We have issues with redlining, where certain communities were only allowed to purchase property in certain communities, and it was always the worst impacts in the worst communities, areas for climate, what we know now is climate justice and environmental justice. And so those multiple inputs where you keep having the same thing over and over and over again, cumulative impacts is something that we wrestled with also in the DEQ board, because it's just kind of like, it's not just one polluter that happens. It's, I've got bad water, I've got bad land, I've got bad air, and which of the many pollutants that I've come up against is the one that's caused my cancer? Because I
Mm.
also have bad health care, and maybe I have no health care. We just finally expanded Medicaid in North Carolina. I too am in North Carolina. That's to me, I know I'm talking to theologians here. I'm the probably the only layperson here, but I always think about, how did I get involved in this? And I think back to Micah 6:8. He's shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Um, you know, act justly. What does that mean to us? Well, that's civil rights, that's environmental justice, that's ensuring that one group is not having those detrimental health, economic impacts, because it is also economic injustice. If I can't sell my property, if I do happen to own this piece of property and I can't sell it because it's a brownfield or
Yeah.
it's a Superfund site or it's
Mhm.
polluted, um, again, I've just taken away that one piece of economic goal that every quote unquote American holds on to. And it's usually that biggest economic driver in the family is your real estate, is your home. And if you can't sell it and it's not safe for you to live in, and you can't get rid of it, so you can't move, and all of those cumulative type impacts, all of those things coming at you all at once is
Mhm.
what makes this such a unchristlike feel, an injustice,
Mhm.
and something that involves both civil rights as well as environmental rights.
Well, thank you so much for that. And as you say that, I'm hearing the crisis of CAFOs down in the lowlands of North Carolina. People spraying hog waste in the air. How do you sell that property? Places like Baden Lake, where you've got Alcoa that poison the water. Who wants to buy a home on the shores of a poisoned lake? So not only does it impact your health, but it does impact you economically as well. Thank you for that. Dr. Laughinghouse, you started off talking a little bit about environmental justice. Can you give us a little history lesson? How did this develop, and why in Warren County did this come about?
Sure. Well, in Warren County, there I think it was a Hosky. I can't remember the name city, but they found out that this company, it was a painting company, I believe. They, of course, with anything that is produced in a factory, there's going to be some residue. And so they actually got the government approved for them to lay these carcinogenic residue, I'll just say that's a nice way to put it, right? Down the roads in a predominantly Black African American area. And so the people came together, and of course, they also came together, and some of the leaders, of course, more popular today too, that ended up going to prison behind their justice work. Reverend Ben Chavis, the UCC, United Church of Christ, came together, and that's when they developed the report that coined the term of environmental, racism. And these things, I mean, there was a lot of other things happening before where African Americans were noticing that, due to the environment, what was going on. And one of the people that I mentioned two women, one of both of African descent, but
Mhm.
Fannie Lou Hamer, when she started her Freedom Farm Co-op, she said basically the poverty here in Mississippi, how we're going to overcome this, but by starting this farm co-op. But even there, she noticed like the land and the things that they had to overcome. So she recognized that the people had to return to the land. And that's the one thing that I've been listening a lot to a lot of First Indigenous authors speaking about care for the earth. Because my perspective is that in order for us to also mobilize, is we have to really show our connections with the oppressions that we're experiencing.
Yeah.
Black folks, brown folks. I mean, right now we think of farm workers solely as, Mexican Americans or Latinx people, but we also know that this country's way of making money was agriculture, and it was through slavery, enslavement, and
Mhm.
the whole connection with that, and even here in North Carolina, with areas like I'm thinking we're talking about water, like the people of the dark water, the Lumbee tribes,
Mhm.
and how this connection of always trying to pull us away from our identity, which is connection with the land. And so you have, like we were speaking of, first indigenous, tribes here, they're like wrestling with, okay, we want economic independence. So many of them are, we're going to have casinos because we need this. But then it's like, it's also pulling away from our identity. And as a forerunner of environmental justice, I would say Du Bois really talks a lot about that and how the point of of slavery was to pull African Americans away from this connection with the land. So if you think about it, if I am enslaved, I really don't want to have anything to do with this land if this is something that is being used to oppress me. So environmental justice movement kind of began here in North Carolina. One of the many reasons why I can't pull myself to move away because it's just so much rich history
Mhm.
in North Carolina, and so many examples of people that have taken into their hands like how we're going to mobilize against the government, and I would even go as far, I would argue that environmental injustice is so unconstitutional and is a extension of slavery.
Mm.
It's
Mm.
an extension of slavery. So you're talking about the Fifth, the 13th, and the 14th Amendment, because they're not supposed to continue on to put us in situations that continue slavery. So if I'm in an area like um, Reverend Carter just said earlier, that I cannot sell a home, I cannot move from a certain area. It
Yeah.
keeps me confined. But let's also talk about the fact, why should I have to want to sell a place where I'm connected to the land?
Mm.
So for me, it's entirely unconstitutional, and it is an akin to it's slavery that they have really put a lot of us into.
Thank you. Thank you for that brilliant analysis and history lesson too about this. Major Carter, I'd love to hear a little bit about the kinds of fights that you're having with environmental justice in your community. I know that you have been intimately involved in your own community with some of these issues. Oh, we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Yep. My bad. I'm so sorry. I was trying to be polite there. Um, my neighbors are the community. In full disclosure, my town is an affluent, predominantly white town
Mhm.
that is only 35 years old. But it was the town that grew up it's because folks, and remember, we're in North Carolina, we're in the South. Let's keep it real. Didn't want to live with those other folk, Black folk that were in the polluted part. I'm in like the fourth largest county geographically in North Carolina, Brunswick County, and most of our brownfields are Superfund site. The areas that are highly polluted are all in the predominantly Black community of Navassa, and stretch out a little bit into the formerly Black, we're now getting gentrified community of Northwest. The demographics are upside down. Navassa, at one point when I moved here 20 years ago, was about 90% African American. It's down to about 84% African American. Our county is 84% white. And remember what I just said, that the brownfields, all except two, there's 7 in the county, all except 2 are all in Navassa. The
Wow.
Superfund site is in Navassa. And I got here and got involved in fighting in environmental justice because they were about to put a mega landfill in Navassa.
Mhm.
And they were selling it as this was going to be a good thing to help the Black people. And I mean, it almost came out like a caricature of something you'd hear back in the good old days. All right, all you people of color, just come over here because I'm your friend. I'm going to give you a job, and I'm gonna, nobody else will treat you right, but I'm gonna treat you right. I'm gonna give you this, and you just let me put my 750-acre landfill that can go up to 350 feet tall, which you'll never notice here in the coastal plains. Don't you worry about it. We're gonna put some grass on top of it and put some trees. Don't fuss over anything hard here. Don't worry about the fact that it may leach into your water, or those little pieces of shrapnel, because this auto shredder residue might kill you during the next hurricane or tornado, but we're going to take good care of you. And so we are fighting still for the cleanup of the town of Navassa. Every other community in our county is enjoying incredible economic growth. My town is one of the fastest growing towns in not just North Carolina, but in the country. When I moved here, there were about 2,500 people. There are now 31,000 people in my town in a course of 20 years. Navassa has actually lost people. They had about 2,000 people. They're now down to about 1,350. Now, they're going to be growing because, again, we're in the fastest growing county, and they've got 2 major subdivisions going into that community. But that's where we get to that gentrification part, because neither of those subdivisions are priced at a point where people who look like me can really afford to necessarily purchase anything on that property. And it's on the good property. It's near the interstate. It's not near the polluted part, the brownfield part of town where people still live. When it rains, it floods in certain neighborhoods. That happens throughout the state of North Carolina, particularly here in southeastern North Carolina. You'll find that the predominantly African American, indigenous, as well as where many of our undocumented brothers and sisters have to live, when it rains hard, when anything bad or adverse weather comes, wherever they live, that's where the adverse weather goes, because nobody else wanted to live there. Nobody else wanted to purchase there. And they're certainly not going to be able to sell it or get any other kind of money, or even if they want to move, they can't afford to move, and no one's going to buy it from them. So what do we have here in southeastern North Carolina? Remember, you found Gen X here first in Wilmington, in our water. You have coal ash. We have the Duke site here that we had coal ash ponds. By the way, the coal ash pond was next to the Cape Fear River, was actually part of the Cape Fear River. And when we had Hurricane Florence, the pond burst and went downstream in the water. And the next town downstream was Navassa. Oh, by the way, okay. We have CAFOs that are upstream of us in Sampson and Duplin counties off the Cape Fear River. And whenever the CAFO lagoons overflow, they come where? Downstream to all of us. So we have that as well to worry about. We've had methyl bromide. We've got a Superfund site that we're cleaning up. So I like to say, you name it, we got it. The wood pellet industry in Enviva, which is now starting to have some financial problems finally. Well, the wood chips go out of the Port of Wilmington. We're here with the Port of Wilmington. And so I've told now EPA Administrator Michael Regan, when he first came here, when he was Secretary of DEQ, if you name an environmental justice problem, we probably have an example to show you down here in southeastern North Carolina. But they're only in the neighborhoods of least resistance. They're in the Black neighborhoods. They're in the African American neighborhoods. They're in Black neighborhoods. They're in the Hispanic neighborhoods. They are in the indigenous neighborhoods, and they're in the poor white neighborhoods. And so how do we make this better? We got to fight, got to join together. We have to do what's right. We can't let our brothers and sisters, we have to be our brothers and sisters keepers. Yeah, it doesn't affect my neighborhood, but if it affects my neighbor, it affects me.
I love that. And we're gonna have to return to that a little bit later on too, because I think I want us to ponder a little bit later on how do we begin to make this better? Dr. Lorraine, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the context in which you have worked in environmental justice and the kinds of impact that it's had disproportionately in your context.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot. So I'm thinking one of the more fascinating things that I think about, especially thinking about water, and I'm thinking about sort of standing rock and lines that get buried underground, is that when we're having a conversation, and I'm kind of going to jump back to this law piece a bit, is that it's not just like a local law. Sometimes this is litigated in Supreme Courts. Laws that aren't necessarily. So when you're talking about environmental justice, you have to do deep property law to figure out sort of how these properties are taken and how they are sold. And in the U.S., they distinguish between like riverbeds and waterbeds. If it's navigable water, this is just a random fact. If it's navigable water, the U.S. holds it in trust, the riverbed. So they can bury a pipeline under there if the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers approves that as happening, because even depending, no matter who owns it, because the U.S. government owns it. So in my work, I find it's actually really important to sort of do some of this base education around, well, there's property rights at hand. And depending on who you are, and depends on if you can even come and bring like a suit to sort of to bring an injunction, to even get the ball rolling for you to sort of go forward. In other work, I always tell people that I don't understand the PR work sort of big energy. I don't understand, like in Virginia, why they would go out to Union Hill and choose a freedmen community to sort of try to put a compressor station in. It's just bad PR. You're going back to old plantation land, and then you're going to formerly enslaved communities and generations of people that live there, love the land, and identify sort of with place. And that's what you're seeking, and that's the land you put on. So sometimes I'm like, oh, well, this is like easy to get people up in arms in because it's bad PR. And you can get people to jump in. And sometimes there's just so much going on. Like Veronica's talking about, that it's hard sometimes to sort of get people to narrow in, especially like groups when you're doing organizing work and you're trying to get these communities to pressure local leaders, or you're getting into pressure state leaders. I always feel bad. It's like shooting fish in a barrel, or like choosing which you're going to go after first, and knowing that as you're doing that, they're going to build like a huge mega landfill right next to the river, but you can't, the resources you have. So to go after those fights is it's always hard. It's always complicated, and it can be so overwhelming. So I know that like in this conversation, and when we're talking about how it impacts various communities, it can feel so big. And sometimes I think that's good. It should feel big. You should feel overwhelmed because it's huge and it's a big issue. But also at the same time, you got to jump in the fight that feels, I'm a place-based thinker. I think locality matters. And I think that if it's close to home, it's gonna one, for transportation alone, it's easier, but two, it's where you're from. So, I think deep dive into where you're from and join that fight, and not like make a fight, but figure out where the fight already is, because it's already happening. Folk are already on the ground. Communities that are the most impacted are already, they've been talking. We don't just like get asthma and pretend for years that it's not happening. We're vocal. So if you're going to jump in, find that fight. And so often in this work, I find that to be the most impactful, is when local communities are the ones who jump forward. And when the orgs who do all the EJ work, and when they hold those people up, when they bring those people forward. In Union Hill, it was Ella Rose, who was a stalwart of that community when she went before sort of courts, when she went before and the news agencies, and she said these things. It was so much more impactful for her to stand up and say, this is my health, this is my life, this has been my community since my ancestors were freed. So I think that in that sort of, as you're doing this, and all the, and sort of racial justice, the circles, this is common parlance, but sort of in EJ circles, there needs to be a little bit more work done to sort of uphold the people most affected, and push them forward. So that's where I see that being where you win, where those fights have been won, because we do win. I mean, it's not like everything doesn't get won. Some big fights do win. But I've only ever seen that sort of win happen when they're held up. Standing Rock, and that wasn't a win. I don't want to hold that up as a win because it's not, but that becomes huge nation news sort of because Indigenous folk and the local people are being held up. So I think that's where this work has the most potential and the most success.
Thank you for that response. And I'm pondering here a little bit. I've heard us talking around this issue. What is the role of the fossil fuel industry? You've talked about the chemical industry and utilities and things. What is the role of these kinds of institutions in perpetuating this sort of environmental injustice? Please feel free to jump in as you choose.
I'll take that one first because I'll use methyl bromide as a good example.
Mhm.
We had a company coming here and again, this happened to be not an indigenous, a poor white community. When we walked in there and said, we're here to fight for your environmental justice, they were like, no, we can't, we're not. And then we explained, this is going to help you. We're going to actually keep this from happening. And went, oh, tell us more. Okay. Um, and it turned out, and Rodney, you may remember this because I think I was relatively new to the EJ board when this happened. This company was from Australia, and they wanted to set up. They had applied for a permit to put this methyl bromide. Methyl bromide is used to take the little bugs and stuff off the logs when you do logging. Before you put them in shipping containers and ship them overseas. Well, they don't use it overseas in the EU because, oh, by the way, it was banned in the EU because methyl bromide, one, makes a hole in the ozone layer, and it's incredibly toxic and dangerous. So much so that one of the shipping containers was opened in New Zealand. One of the longshoremen got a whiff of it, and he ended up dying. Okay.
Wow.
But here we had this great permit that said basically they were going to check out which way the winds were blowing into the local community by putting a windsock, I just you not, outside of the Connex container they were going to use, and they were going to seal the container with duct tape and sandbags. And this gentleman got up in front of a public hearing and to all these people and said, this is exactly how we do this work in Australia. My family lives next to one of these plants. This is perfectly safe. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, this can't be safe with the EU. They don't allow this kind of nonsense. What is this guy talking about? Well, I'm a woman of faith, and I'm going to tell you what, just so happened I was going to Australia that year on a trip. And just so happened the little town I was staying in had an ecotourism day, festival. And this poor gentleman who worked from Queensland, one of the areas in Australia, was sitting at this table all by himself because he worked for the government. Nobody wanted to talk to him. And I walked to him and said, hey, listen, I'm from the United States, and there's one of your countrymen over there telling us that this is how they do methyl bromide with windsocks and duct tape and sandbags. And is it true? Is that legal? And he's like, what? Are you kidding me? So I pull up on my phone and I show him some stuff I've saved. He's like, you got an email address? Tell you what, when I get back to my office Monday, I'm going to send you some information. Okay, fine. So I sent him the stuff that was in the permits. He sent me stuff back answering it. I then wrote this scathing letter to DEQ before their public comments ended that said, hey, this guy's lying his butt off on his permit because here's all the stuff from it turned out, not by coincidence, I believe, it turned out this guy said he was from the exact same area of Australia that I was in. And so it's like, he's telling a bald-faced lie here, as we like to say in the South, okay? So what are you going to do, DEQ? You're going to let him have the permit? Well, the answer was no. And then Secretary Regan walked in and said, when I told you guys to take this job seriously, I didn't expect you to go to Australia. But that wasn't my idea. The Lord had other plans for that. But here's the kicker. They still ended up sending those logs overseas. It just cost them more money and they got less profit. Okay. There were other ways to take the bugs off the logs And there were other ways to not use methyl bromide and mess with the ozone layer and not potentially let off a plume of colorless, odorless fumes that could have killed local livestock and children, because there was an elementary school within a half mile of the site. But it would have cost them more money. So they then, once we got a permit, once we went through and got rules established and everything else, it cost them more money. So that's the bottom line for industry. They can still have industry, those fossil fuel guys, they can still make money, but they got to be environmentally friendly, and they're just gonna have to accept that they're not going to make as much money and as much profit. It's not that they won't make money, they just won't make as much money as they're used to making.
Thank you for that. That is, it's frightening to listen to that. I'm so grateful to hear about that story. I hear God's hand. I see God's hand at work in that midst of that narrative there. Candace, to what extent is this just the byproduct of having a capitalist system where we put profits over the significance of the planet and its people?
I was just thinking that throughout everything that was just said. I mean, I remember when I was my undergrad, I wanted to go to law school. That didn't happen. But I was teaching. I was assisting with a business ethics class,
Mhm.
and I found things so easy. I'm like, well, hey, this makes sense to do it this way. But things kept coming up about profit and profit. I mean, that is just the we can say the American way, but we know it's even further. It's the Western economic imperialism. And so it's going to take companies that make the decision to say, like, okay, it might not be the profit that we would like, but that just goes against the whole concept of capitalism, right? I mean,
I'm going to interrupt you. I don't think you can depend on the companies. I think we need regulation. We're going to have to make
exactly.
laws that
Yeah.
make them do the right thing, because they're not going to do it on their own.
Well, we need the laws, and then we also need the laws to implement the laws, right? Because you're going to have the laws, and then they won't, be implemented. They won't follow them. But the roles, I think, also we need the laws, and then we also need people and organizations to come up and come forth, because I don't think there's a lot of opportunities for people to come up with ideas for green jobs and greener way of doing things. For me, I don't think companies hope I don't get in trouble. I'm still looking for a job. I don't think companies like Duke need to have their hands all the time. The companies that are high up with the fossil fuels, why should they also be the ones to get all the money to decide as far as the green? And I know that comes from us coming together and mobilizing people to also believe that they can come up with those things. But capitalism is always just a part of it, right? When it comes down to it, they're like, when you said they're sending these laws elsewhere and they knew good and well that's not the way it's done. Wait, I'm going to leave any type of ethics and morals out of it. And as long as I may not get the 400 million, we may only get 350 million. So, I mean, and they, of course, they do not care about the lives of the people that are, that are going to be impacted by that. So I think capitalism is just a huge thing that we're consistently fighting against, right? And that is just it. From let's talk about racial justice. For me, I'm also adamant talking about the gender issues, because it's the women that are largely affected by things when we're talking about water. These women that are in these areas and even with fossil fuels, right? These women are in areas and they're having babies or they're becoming barren due to the environment. And then these things are not really talked about. Like I just found out a couple of years ago, I'm from Oakland, grew up around Fruitvale. Fruitvale has a higher lead content than Flint, Michigan.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And of course, we're not talking about the water contamination and the fossil fuels and where indigenous people mainly, live. Why? Because that's not going to bring companies money. It's not going to bring the news media money, because less viewers, because people don't like to feel bad about the decisions they make that are wrong.
I think from that, sorry, but on that too, it is that companies aren't going to jump in, and like they're going to profit. I mean, and they're going to profit the most from green energy. That's like Duke and Dominion are going to hold all the contracts, and they do. They're not going to. They already do. They hold all the contracts to build like wind farms and solar farms, and they're going to pass that off to ratepayers. So like they're not profiting. They're probably going to make more money in the long run because those rates will remain high even post infrastructure being built. So then you're talking about issues too of like paying your bills, buying groceries, which is already an issue sort of in EJ circles, food justice here too. So those issues matter. But also this isn't like new. None of this is, you grew up in those communities, and that's not at all shocking. I think if more people look deeper into sort of where they grew up, they would find sort of environmental justice issues. And maybe, I mean, I do that, look at your health issues, track those things, see what's going on, pay attention to your own body. You know, in 1901, Onondaga Lake, you could no longer take ice out of it because of the soda ash pollution at that point. And Onondaga Lake up by Syracuse in Onondaga Nation was known to be the most polluted lake at one point in our history, with Honeywell dumping mercury into it for many years. And that just after 15 years, a 15-year sort of project ended in 2017. That cleanup just kind of got underway and began. And Onondaga Nation and the state of New York and the federal government fought Honeywell in court. You know, so you're dragging your companies want to profit, but they don't want to pay once they've done it. So I think there's a piece of like, yeah, the companies are going to make money, but you're also going to drag them to court. You're going to have to make DuPont clean up sort of like the Shenandoah River. You're going to have to make them come in and do that work and force them to do it. And they're not going to do it to completion. Like I'm not going to swim in Onondaga Lake for a bit because it's still, mercury pollution is still an issue. I mean, people used to grab it and sell it back to Honeywell. You can grab it off the side of the lake and run it back to Honeywell and give it to them. But I digress. I think it's such a big ball of mixed things that you have to go at it from a what Leanne Simpson calls that you got to get your constellation of co-resistance together. You got to get that, and you got to go after all these issues, and you got to go after the corporations, don't know that they're going to profit, but don't expect them to save you, because capitalism will bury you in the ground and dance on your grave if it could.
Thank
or
you.
with you out of court, or
Yeah.
with you out in court, because
Yeah.
they've all got very deep pockets and a whole army of lawyers. And so they will happily just string it along through appeals and everything else and not ever admit liability.
And if they do get fined, the fine is usually so small, it doesn't even cause them to change their policies and direction. Thank you for that. And then one thing that you surfaced in that last question, that last response to Garen, was the fact that this is not just a rural issue. This is not just a down east issue. And Candace, you also talked about the fact that this impacts urban areas. We see high instances of asthma in places near coal ash power plants. We see high instances of water pollutants in places like Flint and Jackson, Mississippi. We see high instances of these things that impact urban communities. So I want us to make sure that we remember that this is not just a southern North Carolina, Virginia, rural kind of, this impacts many different minoritized communities, many different poor white communities in a significant way. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about, just first off, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and you can ask them as we go so we can bring some audience questions in too. But I want to talk a little bit about the spirituality of this. And I'm going to come to you, theologian Laughing House. I'm going to come to you for a second. Let's say, to what extent does the theological, do we need a theological argument to respond to environmental injustices? To what extent is this a spiritual crisis that we have to address?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that is my big thing, is that this is all theological. And I don't mean just theological in realms of like Catholic or Protestant. I mean, spirituality. All of this is how our understanding of the divine and how we are to connect with the divine through this interconnection with humanity, nature, spirit, non-human animals, everything. And that, for me, that's important. That has to, I read a lot of texts and articles, and I see a lot of people doing amazing work that I just admire. And that's one thing I see that's missing a lot is the theology behind it. And the reason why I think it's important is because I remember some years ago I was reading it was Al Gore's book, Climate Reality.
Mhm.
Can't remember which book, but he started off talking about people know what to do, people know where to go to do things, but we're trying to figure out the why. And for me, I strongly believe that the why is connected with if we could show everyone that within their own spirituality or theology, there's this connection with caring for the earth.
Mhm.
I have 3 daughters and I teach them about all different, different faiths, and that, every single sacred text has a reference to what Christians call the golden rule, and how we're supposed to care for the earth. And even within not just indigenous cultures, but African spirituality, there's this how we are to treat one another. And the South African, philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because you are.
Mhm.
I extend that too, because even within our conversations about caring for one another and looking at things racially, as far as race and theology, extend that to not be so humanocentric.
Mm.
We should be looking at all of creation. And that is within every single faith tradition that I've looked at, is consistent there. Why is that important? For one reason is that, I mean, I've had relatives, they did not go to church, do anything, but, they if they knew they needed something, they would fast. There are people who are so far removed from the institution of a faith, but they have certain things that they hold on to and they can stick to them. And
Mhm.
so I think beyond, I mean, these things are of course great with us knowing the laws, fighting the laws, knowing, okay, we need to garden more. Let's look at areas where there's not enough food. I don't say food deserts, I say foodscapes, because even things grow in the desert. We're talking about areas where there's like no food. So when we look at um, and provide a theology to these things, one will start seeing where we're more alike, and because we all need to be able to come together. And
Mhm.
that's the will. The will of a person largely is due to some type of spiritual encounter and
Mhm.
connection with the divine. And that's why theology, and as an eco womanist, theologian, and ethicist, that's why I really have been trying to articulate that even more, because we all, like my neighbors are um, my neighbors can be Muslim, they can be, representative of Baha'i faith. We're all breathing the same nasty, toxic air. What are we going to do together? And how can we come together? And the way that we can stick through
Mhm.
things is largely due to our faith and theology.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And you've touched on some crucial issues there that I want to return to in a second for our final question when I get back to it. But I want to ask this question to Dr. Lorraine. Mark Davis asks, how does man, the creature, connect to creation? And how does this tie into our environmental justice issue?
Yeah, I think, and Dr. Lappinghouse, I think is getting sort of at that. It's thinking, um, it's holding those two words together, creature and creation, and holding your place in that, holding that you are a part of creation. If we're using that language, and placing yourself with, there's so many ways that we try to nuance how we talk about nature. But theology, as we know it, and we've come to know it, it does have a divide. It has this long divide between nature and human, and sort of the ordering. And there's lots of good thinking here about the ordering of creation, and sort of undoing that work. Undoing that thought work is the beginning of that. Undoing sort of the theology of hierarchy that places sort of humans at some apex, or humans just beneath sort of like a celestial divine being, and realizing that you're part of creation. The Old Testament talks about dust to dust, And I find great comfort in that, because if there's anything that I want to be, it's the dust of the very thing that gives me life. I think that's one of the more beautiful sort of images that comes out of sort of the tradition, the biblical tradition. But I think here, once you do that work, once you do sort of that thought work, you've got to do some reimagining of your social relations. Because if you are a creature in creation, then everybody's your kin and everything is your kin. Then you're seeking right relation. So how do you get to right relations? How do you, there's lots of thought that we don't get environmental justice without right relations with Indigenous people and right relationships with Black folk and brown folk. We're not going to get there if we don't have those right relations first. So I think, the act of becoming and of doing that work, of becoming, it's always this process. I don't think we're going to get there tomorrow. And I don't think we're going to get there, maybe in 10 years, but I think that work has to keep going and plugging along. I'm interested too, sort of in not just doing that work at the front, but we're at a point where we're talking about like a theology beyond the tipping point, or theologies of the hellscape, if we want to get real dramatic about it. What is this, what's next as we approach sort of catastrophes in migrations? How do we imagine sort of right relations in disaster? How do we think about people then? How are we neighbors then? How are we kin then? How are we in relation then? Because there's a lot of stuff that I'm not sure we're going to stop.
We can only stop it if we try. Nothing beats a failure but a try. I remember someone used to tell me all the time. So we got to at least begin by trying and bear faithful witness. I know that we are almost out of time, so I'm going to ask for our last response. And the question I want to ask is, what can faith communities do? How do faith communities begin to try to make some progress in this issue? And I'm going to start off with you, Major Carter, because I know that you have used your faith community to try to address some of these issues.
When I first got involved in environmental justice, it was actually in a fellowship hall of a church, because the community came together, and the place to meet was the place that held the most people was the fellowship hall of the closest church. It turned out to be a Baptist church, but and that kind of set the stage, because as we all came together as a community, whether you believed or not, whether you were Jewish and here you are in a Baptist church, we started our meeting with a prayer, asking in our case, and the Lord to help us, guide us, give us the wisdom we needed to be able to come together as neighbors and to be successful. And we were. Okay, I believe that was because of our faith, and I believe that the Lord, the old expression was God don't like ugly, but Proverbs told us you don't exploit the poor just because they're poor, and that's really what environmental justice is. You're exploiting the poor because they're poor, and you don't think they're going to have the means or the ability or the wherewithal to know how to fight you back. So that's how you use it. You just take the Bible, take the Bible and open it up, and you'll probably find a verse there that can get somebody's attention from a faith-based community and say, this is why you need to join me in this fight.
Thank you so much. That was such a brilliant biblical analysis there. This is what it looks like to defraud the poor. This is what it looks like. This is why it's a deeply theological issue. Dr. Lorraine.
Yeah, I think the verse you quoted earlier when you were in Micah 6, those are all action verbs. Act, speak, walk. You got to do something, and the Bible invites you to action. So there's good thought. Think the good thoughts. Look at read the news about a climate, and don't paralyze yourself. So I think you got to get out, and you got to make calls. Faith communities have the unique ability of already being gathered and having space. So open your space up to the meetings, give the people food. There's all kinds of good environmental justice work you can do to just start the conversation going, but you gotta open space and walk and speak and do. And otherwise, you're just going to feel like nothing's happening. And I really think, there's individuals and there's communities, and you can act in accord with each other. And I think faith communities really, really can get out and do that.
Amen. We need to do what we're called to do. We need to bring people together. We need to work together to effectuate change. Dr. Laughinghouse, let me give you the last word tonight.
Just joining in with that, we can do this as faith communities and involving our people. But I would say also involving, I think, Reverend Carter, as you were saying, involving other faith communities, having interfaith opportunities. Those things are great, but it's something that she said when you said we were quoting Proverbs, or how we treat the poor. Really getting people to think that the poor, when I would present that, is that even though we may not have the money, we may have laws against us, we are still God's. We are still in the image of God. And when we have that understanding, that riles people up to mobilize, because then you start to demand what you know is yours instead of asking for rights, knowing what's yours. And I would extend that too on who else is the poor. Even though this wonderful earth, we can still grow everything, the earth is being treated poorly. So environmental justice, again, going beyond the humanocentric and into looking at the earth and looking into animals as well, because we are called, and the animals also have the ruah of God as well. So it's much bigger than oftentimes that we begin to think. Like so every day I'm kind of always like, oh, I can include this and I can include that. And I think that's the beautiful thing of environmental justice, as you're saying, having the tentacles that touch everything. It's social justice, period.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for tying it up so nicely in a bow. This impacts our planet. It impacts our people. It impacts all animals. It impacts us all. We have a responsibility to live justly on this planet because everyone is impacted by our actions. We need to move beyond our selfish self-focus, our desire for profits, and realize the necessity of seeking solutions that work for all the planet, its people, and the animals that live here. I just want to end with this one word as a closing prayer. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and all those who dwell in it. Let us treat them all with dignity, respect, and love.
Okay.
Amen. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you so much to my wonderful, brilliant panel of speakers, Major Veronica Carter, Dr. Garen Lorraine, Dr. Candace Laughinghouse. You all are amazing. Thank you for the work that you continue to do. We need you. You can't take a day off now. We need you to get this good work and to protect this planet and to help people to see what we must do. Let me turn it over to Mike. Mike, please take it away, my brother.
Dr. Sadler, and thank you all for watching. Don't miss our next panel discussion titled Affirmative Action on Tuesday, May 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, enjoy the rest of your